Hi, today we are going to practice subtracting decimal numbers. Here we go. Okay, one very important point we need to make before we start this mental math strategy for subtraction is we need to recognize that subtract simply means find the difference. So if I need to subtract 1 8/10 from 7 5/10, that simply means I need to know the difference between these two numbers. I need to know how much space or what value is found between these two numbers. We're going to use this piece of paper to represent the difference between these two numbers. So on one side of the difference, we will have our 1 8/10. And on the other side, we are going to have our 7 5/10. Now, you may look at these numbers and say, I want to stack these. I want to just do the traditional algorithm. But if you just take a moment to rearrange these numbers and to make some friendlier numbers out of them, you'll realize that it is so much faster to do it in your head. Now, what I'm going to do is a little shift. I'm going to shift the difference up a little bit. The difference between 1 8/10 and 7 5/10 is the same as the difference between 2, see how I just shifted this up 2/10, and 7 7/10. See how I just shifted that number up 2/10? So the reason I added 2/10 to each number is to give me friendlier numbers. The difference between 1 8/10 and 7 5/10 is the same as the difference between 2 and 7 7/10. But because I know this, I have just created a much simpler subtraction question. Now my question is 7 7/10 minus 2. Both of these answers have the same difference, but this one is much easier to do mentally. 5 7/10. We're going to use this strategy of simply shifting our numbers, shifting so that the difference is much more obvious between our two friendlier numbers than the two original numbers. Let's try some examples. So I'm looking for the difference between 2 9/10 and 3 4/10. Now, it would be a lot easier if I could make one of these a whole number. Since 2.9 is very close to a whole number, I'm just going to shift my numbers to 3, and since I moved this up 1/10, I'll move this up 1/10. Okay, same difference, easier numbers. Now I have 3 5/10 minus 3, 5/10. Okay, here I need to find the difference between 3 7/10 and 7 1/10. Okay, I'd like one of these to be a whole number. It doesn't matter if I shift up or down. Let's try going down for this one. So let's shift down to 7. Since I went down 1/10, I'll go down 1/10. Now I have 7 subtracting 3 6/10. That's going to give me 3 4/10. Let's just look at this more closely. 7 subtract 3 6/10. Maybe that one wasn't super easy in your head. When we're subtracting a whole number, it's generally easier than if it's the whole number subtracting the decimal number. But for this, just do it in parts. 7 minus 3 gives me 4. And then from the 4, I will subtract the 6/10. So you can kind of go left to right when you're starting with a whole number. Either way, you'll end up with 6 4/10. Okay, let's try these next two without the visual difference bar, since I think we know what we're doing by now. I'd like to make this a whole number, so I'm going to bump it up to a 3. So since I bumped it up by 6/10, this also needs to be bumped up by 6/10, so I can keep my difference the same. And the answer is 2 9/10. Here, if you're doing a level B or C question, you'll see hundredths in your numbers. I'd like to make this a whole number. So in order to do that, I've had to increase it by 12 hundredths, which I'll do over here as well. Okay, so now I have a pretty straightforward question. It leaves me with 2 and 27 hundredths. Okay, now it's your turn. Pause the video, try these questions, and then come back and check your answers. Okay, so just remember, we are going to simply shift our numbers, same amount on each side, to make friendlier numbers, maintaining the same difference between the two numbers. We've already established it's easier to subtract a whole number than it is to subtract a decimal number from a whole number. So let's try to make our second numbers here all whole numbers. This is going to be a 4. So if I want to subtract 4, then I'm going to need to bump this first number up by 2/10, which leaves us with 1 and 8/10. If I'd like to subtract a 3 instead of a 2.5, to bump everything up by 0.5 or 5/10. So that means I'm doing 6 and 7/10 minus 3, which is 3 and 7/10. Here I'd prefer to subtract a 5, so my 7 and 3/10 becomes a 7 and 4/10, which leaves me with 2 and 4/10. Here I would much prefer to subtract 4, so I'll bump this up by 5 hundredths, which leaves me with 4 and 26 hundredths.